everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Dialogue, arranged by us in the organization COVID-19 Schools and Children. And from our side, it's me today, Maria Thorland, and we have Gabriella Maya for the first time. Welcome. And we have our special guest this week, Andrew Ewing, who many of you know from many occasions in Veckans and World Health Network and other places. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to have you. I wanted to just say shortly before we get going that Gabriella's feed has some issues. So if she disappears every now and then for a second, it's technical and not personal. Andrew Ewing, we're glad to have you. Like I said, you are a professor, chemistry and molecular biology at the University of Gothenburg, and you're also a member in Swedish, Kungliga Vetenskapsakademien, or in English, the Swedish Academy of Science. And like I mentioned, the World Health Network, you've been active in a few different groups. And we're going to hear about your expertise, but before we start, please tell us how you ended up in Sweden, because you're actually from the US from the beginning. Do you mind telling us?
Yeah, I grew up in New York, actually. So if I go back to New York and spend an hour, I start speaking like a New Yorker. But then I was in Indiana for a number of years, and North Carolina for a year, and then at Penn State for about 20 years before I moved to Sweden for family reasons. So. And things have changed a little bit, but that's what happens. And I've been here since 2007, so 15 years now. And so I still don't speak the best Swedish, but it's my Swedish is okay. It's coming along. But part of the problem is work is almost entirely in English. It makes it a little bit difficult. It might be easier if we spoke more Swedish at work. But it's a beautiful country, beautiful people, despite some of our differences during the pandemic. And it's amazing when you have a really large change in the force. Okay, use a Star Wars thing. Okay, something that really makes a big change. People realign in different ways than they would have before. But you'll see once we really get past this, which we're not yet. Everyone will realign back to where they were, almost for sure. It's just the way of the world.
And is that good or bad?
I think that's good. I think it's good. I think we'll bring along with us some new friends that we didn't have before. Certainly, I've met so many people first across Sweden and then across the world during this pandemic that I would never have met otherwise. So that's the silver lining to a very bad situation. To meet a lot of really interesting people. Some of them, and also learn just how poisoned some people's souls are. That I wouldn't have known before, and so I can stay away from them. But I've seen far more people, in my opinion, with really good hearts that have really want to do good things and during this pandemic. And I've learned a lot. I mean, I've learned a lot from doctors and scientists and politicians that I've interacted with. So it's quite nice.
Well, it's great to start with some silver linings. It's good to hear that.
I don't have a lot.
And Andrew, you're the head of the Andrew Ewing Research Group in Gothenburg, right?
Yeah, well, that's what we call my webpage.
Right. Well, you've done a lot of work on various forms of cancer. So we're wondering what made you look into the effects of COVID on the brain?
Oh, yeah, no, I've done very little on cancer. So I've done a lot of work on brain, on neuroscience, and understanding how single cells in the brain communicate with each other, and relating that to things like Parkinson's disease, and now a little bit towards Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, I don't ask me about cancer. I'm not really. I know some things about cancer. I know some of the immune hypothesis of cancer and so forth, but I'm not a real expert on anything in cancer.
No, sorry, but COVID on the brain then. That's the thing that we're interested in.
Well, I mean, since I work on the brain, and I have been for 35 years or so, I really became more and more interested when I started seeing what was happening with COVID in the brain. And we knew in early 2020 that some of the studies were starting to come out showing that the inflammation from COVID was affecting the brain, and big arguments about whether SARS-2 actually gets into the brain. It does, but for a long time we weren't sure. And there's a lot of people that want absolute proof before they'll say anything happens. And science is not really run that way. This is a disconnect between some doctors and most scientists. And some doctors are great and understand this, but some don't. They seem to think they want to have an absolute proof before they'll start discussing something. Science is very speculative. I mean, we speculate all the time. And I've had people say, oh, well, you think it seems like, so that means it's not right. I'm like, no, that's not the way it works. Okay, that's not the way science goes forward. But we saw a lot of things. To be honest, the very first thing I saw in early 2020 was the study that came out as a preprint on where they looked at 100 COVID patients and they looked at their hearts 3 months later, and 61 out of 100 had heart dysregulation. Okay, let's put it to mildly. And so I mean, this is a huge problem that people still don't get a grip on. I mean, we argue about the numbers and long COVID and so forth, but that's a big number. And then there was a paper came out a little bit after that on the brain and looking at psychiatric effects of COVID. And there's a huge number of psychiatric effects post-COVID. Now, teasing out exactly what's causing them, that's more difficult, but there's no question this is what's causing it. And then there was the paper on the loss of gray matter. You have to understand, in the brain we have what we call gray matter and white matter. And gray matter are the neurons, the actual nerve cells, and white matter are the support cells. And when COVID patients were shown in that study very nicely to be losing gray matter. Now, it took them about a year to get it published for various reasons. Who knows what was happening in review. But I saw it right up in the beginning, early. I got a preprint of it. And then that paper out of the Great British Intelligence Test, where they showed that even mild cases, people were having cognitive losses and having brain fog and memory issues. But I mean, right in the beginning too, as soon as it was shown, which was February 2020, that I heard that you lost your sense of smell, I started suspecting it has to affect the brain. Okay, it could affect the olfactory nerves in the nose, but it didn't make sense, all the data, so it has to go in and affect the brain, and so that's got me interested in this. Don't let me run on. You should stop me. I can get going and I'll never stop.
But this is the actual subject matter that we are so interested in. And you actually have some slides on the presentation. I know that it's extensive, so you.
I just show a couple of slides because otherwise I'll.
Yeah, please do show us some of your slides.
We didn't test this again. Let's make sure. Yes, it works. So, just to give you an idea of what we're facing, okay, with COVID in the brain, and I just picked out a few things, but this is some data that was presented in June 2022. I don't think it's published yet. I haven't seen it yet. I'm waiting. Maybe I've missed it. At the 8th European Academy of Neurology, okay, and they looked at almost 1 million patients, of which 43,000 tested positive. The positive cases had 3.5 times increased risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, 2.6 times with Parkinson's disease, 2.7 times higher with ischemic stroke, and 4.8 times increased with intracerebral hemorrhage, bleeding in the brain. Okay, that's probably the biggest thing. I mean, COVID is a vascular disease. Don't let anybody tell you it's a respiratory disease. That was the obvious immediate symptom, but it's a vascular disease. It's messing with our blood vessels, our endothelial cells, our blood cells, the cells that are carried by the blood, like T cells and B cells. It's messing with all of those.
Okay,
And so-
stop. Would you just explain to people what endothelial cells are? Because that's a key.
The cells are aligning the blood vessels.
Yeah, like inside the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's destructive, and so it's breaking down. The reason that I don't think it's been proven yet, but I think the reason that COVID gets into the brain is because the SARS-2 virus affects the blood vessels around the brain and causes a breakdown of what's called the blood-brain barrier, and so then it can get across. There are other possible mechanisms, but that seems very likely to me, given the amount of damage that it causes to blood vessels. Keep in mind that these numbers are preliminary. And they're preliminary in the sense that they're probably going to get worse, not better. Okay? Things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease take a long time to develop. All right? So the fact that we're seeing a higher risk already is really frightening.
And Andrew, do we know anything about what stage these positive cases were in and severity of their disease? And do you think that matters at all in this study?
Most of these things are being seen across the spectrum. The more severe the disease, the worse it's going to be. So those patients that are in the hospital or those patients in ICU, those will all be those will have a worse outcome in many of the things that we've seen. But some things are seen across. The inflammation and the cytokine release, for example, is seen the same in mild cases as it is in severe cases and so forth. So it's not entirely clear. And recent studies with organelles, which are sort of artificial brain mini brains made from cells, from stem cells, these recent studies have shown that Omicron is doing all the things that we're seeing. This technology has come along so we can look at this, that Omicron is doing the same things we were seeing with the wild type from Wuhan and Alpha and Delta and so forth. So all of them are causing it, and you can get this. Now, let me point out, okay, these are risks. And so it doesn't mean that everyone who gets COVID has that is going to have Alzheimer's disease or going to have Parkinson's disease or ischemic stroke, but it just means that your risk goes up, okay? And I hate to say this, but I mean, we don't know yet. We don't know whether everyone will have some kind of brain damage or a large percentage, or whether it'll only in the end be 5%. We don't know. Now, to me, that's frightening. To many people, they say, oh, well, it's probably going to be 5%, so I'm not going to worry. Okay? This is the way it works, right? So I had a surgical procedure like 15, 20 years ago. And it wasn't a major surgery, but it was one that had a 3% chance of having to be done again. And I remember the doctor saying to me, a really smart doctor, he said it's, bad outcome is 3%. He said, but keep in mind, because I smiled and I was like, okay, that's good, only 3%. And he said, but keep in mind, if you're one of the 3%, then it's 100%. Okay. People don't like to think that way, but that's the way we need to think. Okay. Oops, I forgot that. So children are not exempt, okay? This paper out of Scientific Reports showed that the prevalence of long COVID in this case was 25%. Now, this comes to what is long COVID, okay? The long COVID is defined by symptomatic post-COVID. Okay, so it's continuing on after the acute COVID is over, and that's to me that's only one part of the equation. All right, and the other part of the equation is insidious things that are happening inside, like to the brain, to the heart, to the blood vessels, it's to your immune system, etc. But the prevalent manifestations that were clear from symptoms were mood, fatigue, and sleep disorders. Okay, this has this. Now, when you have mood, it's like saying brain fog. Brain fog is a terrible term. Okay, and I know several friends around town here who have told me that that even today they still have a little bit of trouble with their memory, and they had this brain fog for a long time. But brain fog, what that means is it means you've had neuronal damage, okay? That means you've damaged your neurons, okay? You've damaged your brain. Now, I don't know how many of you want to go out and damage your brain, but I don't want to do that, okay? When I was 18, I boxed for a little bit, and my mother made me stop. She said, "You're getting good grades in school. I don't want you getting hit in the head," okay? And I reluctantly went along with her, but now I'm very happy she made me do that. Each time you get COVID and you get brain fog, it's basically, in my opinion, it's basically like getting a concussion, okay? And you don't want to get repeated concussions. It's very bad for you. Children infected with SARS-CoV, okay, had a higher risk of persistent dyspnea, anosmia, sense of smell and different things, and or fever compared to controls. The thing you keep hearing about with children is children coming up and coming in to the doctor with racing heartbeat, or with what's the term for that? But irregular, fast heartbeats, and they seem almost out of control. This is very frightening. I mean, kids should not have to go through this. This is a great article that Jessica Wildfire published recently, in a Substack article. And she called it, "You May Be Early, But You're Not Wrong, a COVID Reading List." Anybody who wants to look at this is really interesting, okay? They looked at a cohort of 157,000, and this one reference that she gives. There's a bunch of other references, and compared the rates of long COVID in children and adults, and they found that something troubling. About a third of children who get COVID go on to develop long-term symptoms, like the ones we see in adults. So 25%, one-third, it's in that ballpark. Children don't die as often, but they experience some of the same chronic symptoms, especially fatigue and sleep disorders. The only silver lining here is kids tend to recover better after their infection. Of course, we don't know what repeat infections will do to their immune systems over the years. I think we're starting to see what it does to their immune systems. When have you ever in your lives heard of all these diseases making comebacks at the same time?
No.
So in my opinion, this is because we mass infected. I mean, I think in February or March in Sweden, we had 76% of the kids had COVID. And we've mass infected them with this, letting it rip on Omicron, and we've damaged their immune systems. Now, immune systems can recover, and let's hope they do.
Let me just say here, Andy, I have a lot of contact with a group on Facebook with families, for families, by families who have children with post-COVID syndrome.
Yeah.
And I've been in contact with them for information campaign, and quite a lot of the children experience pain,
Yep.
general pain in their body. What mechanism could that be?
I don't know that anybody knows yet, but it's probably, it could be a number of things. It could be a neuronal, some small neuronal damage that's recoverable. It could be the clotting. Remember, a huge part of what's happening in long COVID has to do with these microclots, okay? There's something that people really haven't studied so much, but it's the serotonin hypothesis, where platelets are releasing a lot of serotonin, and this could also lead to painful episodes. And this is difficult. I don't know. My 11-year-old who had COVID in August, as I told you in the before the show, caught it from a relative who didn't tell us she'd been exposed. She's come to me a few times and said, "I have pain in my inner side of my leg, Dad." And I don't know. I mean, I can't figure out. She's also growing like a weed. So this could be growing pains. Okay. That's my hoping that's what it is, or it could be something else. But as soon as she tells me, I monitor and ask her twice a day until she says it's gone away, because I want to make sure that it's not, if she has something like a clot. I told her, if she starts to get numbness, come to me immediately and we'll have you seen. Okay. But nothing's happened. And I tell her, I'm saying it a little bit abrupt with you, but I mean, I tell her in a very careful way, because I don't want her to walk around and frantic, terrified that something's happening to her. I actually have told her it's probably growing pains, but if it gets numb. So I don't know. I mean, this is not something that I think we've figured out yet.
I have another question, Andy.
Okay.
About terminology, because when we see the media reporting on these types of problems, they often treat it, it seems to me, as long COVID is one thing, and it involves these kind of common symptoms that you just talked about. And then another thing is maybe things that you haven't noticed yet, but you might have a stroke later or psychiatric problems or something like that. But it seems like you're saying that maybe you think it would be more useful to call all of these long COVID, or how do you see
Well,
that separation?
I think eventually we're gonna unravel all the different effects that COVID has on the heart, the blood vessels, the blood cells, the liver, the brain, the pancreas, the reproductive organs. It goes on. Okay, the kidneys. We know that it affects all these things. As we unravel what that is and what the long-term prognosis for the damage or the effects on each of those, we will add that in. Okay. And this is why, I mean, I know some people have been very critical, but I have pointed out that, especially if you get COVID 2 or 3 or 4 times, your chances of something going wrong with these things goes way up. Never mind inflammation, just the inflammation from COVID can affect a lot of the organs, and we don't really know exactly the mechanisms. It's like the brain. We argue about whether it's inflammation and causing cytokine release, these chemicals that are used to communicate, and the brain and the immune system, or if it's going into the brain directly and affecting it, by damaging cells in the brain, or if it's going in and, I mean, COVID and chemical in test tubes, chemists have been able to take COVID and some proteins and make. It makes protein aggregates like you see in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could be happening. And so all these things will be happening. But right now, the press is focused on symptomatic COVID. So the first part of what you said and what I said before, they're really focused on what we can see as symptoms. And this has really been a problem that I've been fighting against for at least a year or maybe a year and a half. Because when they do that, they go after, it's fatigue, and it's brain fog, and it's all minimized. This is why I say brain fog is like getting a concussion each time, okay, and maybe worse. We need to realize this is real damage, but they're minimizing it by looking at it, and that's when you turn around and they start talking about it's psychological. This is just a bunch of nonsense. A bunch of people around the world are dropping dead now, and I don't know how anecdotal this is, but I mean, that's not psychological. I don't think they psych themselves into dying. So I don't think these kids that are getting more severe RSV or strep A, which is been going up in England, in the UK, which is like the absolute king and queen of COVID, it seems like. This is not psychological.
And it's not about immunity debt either?
No. Immunity debt, first of all, okay, there's immunity debt, and somebody coined the term, I think Ryan Gregory maybe, somebody coined the term immunity theft. Okay, it's important to realize, okay, there is the innate immune system, which is our strongest thing to fight against most of these diseases. Then you have the acquired immune system, for which vaccines work for things, especially things like measles and so forth, that are, and chicken pox and so forth. Okay, and although chicken pox is an interesting story, we're starting to get a large number of anecdotal comments from doctors saying that they're having children come in with their second and even third chicken pox infection, the same kid. Okay, this is alarming. Okay, but that's an aside. But the immunity thing is you do acquire immunity. Okay, when you get sick. Of course, the best way to not get sick is to either get vaccinated or to stay away from the disease. There's no question it's better. Almost every virus out there, except maybe the cold virus, and even that probably does it, has some other bad effects on you, and people just don't realize it. I mean, just think, we've lived with viruses like herpes for a long time because we think of it as minor, but I mean, let's be realistic. We have from measles to polio to HIV, you have all these bad effects, and dengue. Okay, I mean these have a lot of other effects. I don't understand why people would even argue, and most of them affect the immune system. So why people are arguing that COVID doesn't is beyond me, but it does. And I've put out a really nice thread, and I'm developing a bigger page for the World Health Network on COVID and the immune system. But it's important to realize that it does affect it. This paper here that some people have just picked up on, some high-profile immunologists have just today tweeted this paper. It's as if they missed it before. But this is a beautiful paper that shows that you have immunological dysfunction, basically T cells that are being damaged for at least 8 months. This doesn't mean it was over at 8 months. It means that's how long their study was. These patients still had dysfunction at 8 months. There was another study out of China in May 2020, that showed that COVID damaged, or SARS-2 damaged the T cells in patients. And everybody ignored it. They said, oh, it's out of China. I mean, talk about racist. I was really upset about this, but it's on my list that's been put out, and it will be put out more formally. But it damages the immune system. Second, we started out this whole argument on RSV, okay, the respiratory syncytial virus, however you say it, virus. But immunity wanes. I went and looked up papers on this, okay, and the immunity wanes in a year, okay. So this is really poor science to start arguing that by not having RSV and in most cases 2 years since lockdown, okay, that we actually caused an immunity debt for RSV. Now, for some of the other things, you might argue that there's some more, but keep this in mind, okay? The patterns don't fit. When you look at the course of the patterns, they don't fit with an immunity debt. If it was an immunity, if we were lacking immunity, and that's why we're getting sick, you'd expect more cases at the same time. We're getting earlier cases, and we're getting, in many places, in Canada and in the UK and so forth, they're not getting more cases, they're getting more severe cases. So it doesn't match up with this concept that, oh, hey, kids weren't exposed, so now they're getting it. They should be getting the same, right? This is not what's happening.
So what they mean then when they say that this is because of immunity debt, the theory that they're proposing is that these kids or whoever didn't get this disease, and therefore their immune system wasn't primed, didn't get stronger last year. It just spent lazy time and got weaker and weaker because it wasn't challenged. Something like that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's and you this just doesn't and it doesn't make a lot of sense if you look at it carefully. And this is what but they don't want to. The people that were pushing this and are pushing this want to push it because they're trying to argue against lockdowns and masks. This is the real sinister thing behind immunity debt. And immunity debt is a term that was only created 2 years ago, okay? You go back and look in the literature, you won't find it. Okay, they also call it immunity gap, but they created this term. It was a paper out of France discussed it more hypothetically, and a number of minimizers have grabbed onto this and have argued that what we need to do is worry about NPIs, and that it's because of lockdowns and NPIs. I mean, even Sweden is announcing immunity debt. I mean, we're home to the country that never locked anything down. Okay,
exactly. We have two comments here, Andy.
What's that?
We have two comments here I'd like to run by you.
Sure.
I can't really see. It's one from Facebook that just comments as the RSV. So Sweden didn't even have a lockdown, so we'd expect less RSV here, ? If immunity debt was true. I can't see who commented that, unfortunately. But we have a concrete question.
Well, then let me just say to that we had an RSV wave in Sweden last year. Everybody ignores this. Look at Canada too. They say, oh, some expert out of New York said recently, but I think was Canadian, on some talk show, said that RSV there was no RSV for the last 2 winter seasons, or the 2 years or whatever in Canada. And it's actually absolutely false. People are just are just giving out false information. It was all over. People really got on it on Twitter and pointed out that last year there was a wave just like any other normal year. So this is it's falling apart, but there's still, this is this old adage that if you keep saying something, even if it's wrong, if you keep saying it often enough, it becomes truth, and this is what they're after. So what's the other question? Sorry to interrupt you.
The other comment is about HIV. You mentioned that earlier, and there has been a lot of comparison between SARS and HIV. Actually, some scientists are saying that COVID, like HIV, can hide in the body for years. When do you think we'll start to see the long-term effects in Sweden of the lack of preventative measures, especially for kids that are on their third, fourth, fifth infection?
Oh God, I really hope that we don't get the fourth infections or fifth infections. You're going to see very bad things happen. First of all, I want to say that the SARS-2 and HIV comparison is very controversial in the sense that there's a lot of difference between how SARS-2 works and HIV. That said, there are a lot of similarities too, okay? But COVID is not airborne AIDS, okay? This is really important to realize that we're not quite at that level yet, okay? But COVID does affect, the SARS-2 virus does affect, or having COVID, the immune system, okay? There's no question. The SARS-2 virus, more and more work is coming out showing it persists in the body for long periods of time, for sure in long COVID patients. What is still has to be determined, as far as I can understand it, is whether the virus, the SARS-2 virus, is persisting in acute patients that get completely over it and how long it persists. I don't think we know that yet. But in long COVID patients, for sure, it's persisting. There was a study recently, I'm trying to remember more of the details, but there was a study showing persistence, I forget how many months, some number of months after COVID in the tonsils. So in the tonsils in your throat. And I think that study was done in children. At least part of the study was in children. So it is persisting, and this is going to be the problem. I mean, I'm being a little bit careful here because I don't think all the ducks are lined up in this particular shoot. Okay, but I think this is one of the big things we're going to find is that the SARS-2 virus persists. There are papers suggesting strongly that it persists in brain tissue, as well as I said, in the tonsils and in other cells. And I think there's a couple of papers that show that it persists in T cells as well. So it goes in, it hides, and it comes out later. This is probably one of the worst things that we're going to find about this virus. Reinfections, of course, I mean, you don't need persistence if you keep getting reinfected. I think, as Mike Ryan from the WHO says, is that you should try to avoid getting infected at all if you can. That's probably hard. Probably most people listening have been infected once. But you should definitely, whatever you've done, try to avoid reinfections and limit how many times you get infected. Don't go through life saying, okay, I'm just going to get this disease 2, 3, 4 times a year and live with it, because you're not going to live with it for long, or at least you're not going to live happily with it.
We have another question. I'm not sure if you can answer, but give it a shot. Okay. Somebody says, I have a problem with cramps in my legs. 2 months now. What can I do?
If you talk to your doctor about whether you can look for microclots, whether they have the technology to do it. There are clinics in Germany that'll go down there, that long COVID clinics. But I don't know, if it's cramps in your legs, it could be a lot of other things too. It's not necessarily from COVID. So you probably don't want to go through a large expense of going to Germany and this clinic and so forth to go through it. But I mean, I think docs can do blood tests and look to see whether you have a propensity for clotting. I think you should at least ask the doctor if they can do that. I'm not a doctor myself. I'm an MD myself, so I don't know exactly, but I know that's an issue. And that's, I would say you probably don't have a big clot, which can be very can be threatening to your leg or threatening to your life. It doesn't sound like that at all. It sounds more like you have something that's more small and microclots if it's from COVID. And again, I mean, maybe that's 10%. So maybe 90% is that you're cramping because of something else. We've all changed our lifestyles during the pandemic, and so many things can change. And I can't on a webinar diagnose what's happening to you, but those are the kinds of things you might think about. I probably went too far in that as it is. Okay.
I have more questions, Andy. You give me a second. Question, yeah?
Let me just do this one, I think, and then we'll go, and can we do this one and then take questions? Yeah. I'll just end so I can take off my share screen. Takeaways: COVID increases the chance of stroke and other neurological manifestations, even in younger patients, okay? Simply put, even mild COVID can damage the brain from structure to memory and mood, probably only in a percentage of people each infection, but we don't know how many yet. COVID damages the immune system, at least for a time, and it is a myth that COVID does not affect children. And I just want to say that you asked me before about mild versus severe. Almost every study, from brain shrinkage to cognitive dysfunction, etc., all these functions, all these studies show that it's in mild cases as well as severe, although some things are more severe in severe cases. And if you're interested in long COVID, these are some Twitter threads. Okay, this is a place where you can get a lot of information. I have a thread on the brain. Wes Ellie is a doctor who works with long COVID patients, and he has a really cool thread on discussing some of this, and he has some really good videos. And then I did a thread on COVID and the immune system. With that, I think I'll stop sharing and go off here. Oh, I had one more. I'm sorry. I did want one more. On Friday, I attended a long COVID and return to work What Works webinar by Claire Rayner in the UK. Excellent speaker. Since this is being recorded, you can go on later and look at it, but here are the slides and here's the talk. It's all available online. It's an hour-long talk. We had a little bit of a discussion at the end, but it's a really good talk. If you're interested in long COVID, or if you have long COVID, or some of the questions you're asking me, this is by a doctor who is working with the WHO and is really involved in this very much, and she's really, really good. Okay, so at that, I will stop sharing and go to questions again.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll put those links out on our different sites so that you who would like to click on them rather than type them can do so. So we have a question here. Have you received any attention from Swedish media lately for your work on what damages we get from COVID?
No.
Okay, next one. Sorry.
I am kind of media allergic. We published a paper in Time magazine in the fall of 2020 about the Swedish approach, and it wasn't very favorable. And I had threats, a lot of them. So I went offline. I went through the trouble of getting rid of all of my everywhere. I don't know if it's still possible today, but for a long time you couldn't find my address if you went online, which is unusual in Sweden. Because I have a family, and I was worried. I mean, it was kind of ugly, and I just don't like it. And the press, I had one interaction with the press which was quite fair, and then I had a couple others where they twist things, and I'm not into that. I think it's kind of like feeding the dragon, okay? And so I'm a little bit allergic. I wish they would take it more serious. They don't want to. In Sweden, they really, we're still in a state of denial, and we want long COVID to go away, okay? We can't afford it. Most countries can't afford it. It's going to be very expensive. There's a report out of Harvard on long COVID. An economics professor out of Harvard did a report, and I forget, but it's something like $500 billion in the U.S. It's going to be really expensive. It's going to break the bank in most places. Yeah.
Yes. We could do a dialogue only on the consequences on economics and societal proportions.
Yeah.
The next question here we have, when you say the virus persists in the body, does it mean it is still multiplying in the body? And is it possible that long COVID patients are infectious when they continue to have the virus in the body?
Oh, that's a really good question. Uh, I don't think we don't really know, but it's likely. I've seen a number of discussions on this. I think it's likely that if you've got the virus there, that at least in some patients, it's continuing to replicate, and then it's probably means that they're at least somewhat infectious. COVID has been a problem since the beginning in terms of infectiousness, because clearly some patients are way more infectious than other patients, and so you can stand right next to somebody who has COVID and not get it, and another time be across the room and the whole room gets it. This is the super spreading thing, but the super spreading thing isn't really for everyone who has it as a super spreader. And so I think this is something that is not really well known yet. I would want to ask one of my virology or immunology friends to comment on that, before I would go any further than to say that. I think it's likely. Okay, I think it's likely that at least some people with persistence. Well, that's the other thought. One of the theories about the Omicron variant is that it was probably spawned or came out of a patient that had AIDS, okay, in Africa, and it's pretty clear that the virus persists in these immune compromised patients, and if it's not killing them, it just keeps going at a certain rate, and that allows it a better chance to mutate. So, yeah.
Andrew, can I get you to talk a little bit about this COVID-19 consensus statement panel that you have been involved with, and they recently published a long line of recommendations in Nature magazine. Maybe you can tell us about these recommendations a little bit?
Yeah, that's so important. But I wish governments would listen, okay? And this is going to be the real issue. Governments aren't going to listen until there's huge pressure on them, which is going to come from healthcare and the people. People have to rise up and say, wait a minute, we've had enough. We're not going to take more. But bottom line is that basically we all agreed, okay, that we need a vax plus strategy. Vaccines alone are not going to do this, okay? And, some of us have been saying this. I got really attacked in May or June of 2021 for saying that the vaccine was leaky and that it didn't stop infections enough, and that this wasn't going to work by itself. My God, some golf pro who had a Twitter page with 80,000 followers, they all attacked me. Okay, I was just stunned, and then a little while later it just disappeared. I went in that summer. I went in and I rented a RUV, recreational vehicle for vacation, so we could have a safe vacation. And I went in, and the guy was, I had a mask on, and when I went in to rent at the station, and he didn't, and I said, you need to wear a mask. I said, he said, oh, I've been vaccinated. I said, yeah, but the vaccine's leaky. Oh yeah, I heard that, he said. I said, okay, well. Okay, don't tell me you were vaccinated. That doesn't help anything. Okay, and so, whoops. Okay, jumped. So but I think the people have to realize when enough of us. There's a saying that's FAFO. It's F around. I won't swear on webinar, but F around and find out. Okay. And I think enough people are going to have this happen, and then the governments will be pushed. And then they'll realize they've made a mistake, although I think they're starting to. The 386 panelists, okay, on this, that's how many there were. It was beautifully led, what's happening? Okay. project by a few people, but then we all filled out survey after survey after survey, and across the spectrum. I mean, there are minimizers in this group. There are people who most of us think are minimizing COVID who all agreed. Okay, this is really spectacular. 112 countries, 184 organizations. Okay, we need to act together in this world, is the statement, or we'll never solve this. The end game is Vax Plus, okay, and it's not going to be pretty. Okay, that's what I mean about FAFO. It's not going to be pretty. Okay, it has the potential to get much worse than it is now. We keep in mind, convergent evolution of the virus is taking place now. A Delta Alpha Omicron variant or something like that will be extremely dangerous. But even if we don't get a deadly thing like in some of the movies, okay, it's probably not as likely. With the long-term damage I've been talking about will be. Okay, the damage is really serious already, and we've heard of, I heard today of children getting chicken pox multiple times in a year. I was just stunned. All this immunity debt for cause is trying to fight the NPIs. We're fighting each other. We need to come together and work together, and that's what this thing is all about. It's gotten a lot of attention. It's got a really lot of attention. So we're hoping that the governments will start listening.
You mentioned a convergent evolution. Could you explain that?
Well, it means that the virus is going to come, that some of the, usually you think of evolution as, and I'm not an expert in evolution overall, although I'm not bad, I guess, but I'm not really, it's not my area. I actually know a lot about evolution because I spent several years of my life, more than 20 years ago, fighting creationists, okay, who wanted to get rid of evolution in schools, okay. I had to learn a lot, but still, I mean, in simple terms, evolution, usually you think of it as diverging. So where a new mutation, it goes in different directions. It'll go escape immunity by changing the certain things in the spike protein and so forth that the antibodies latch onto. But convergent means that it can come back together. And so what happens is if you get a patient who catches both the alpha, or let's say the delta, everybody remembers delta, even alpha might have been worse. But delta and even the beta was just even worse. But that was South America, so nobody knows about it. But if the delta and the wild type, or the Omicron and delta come back together, now you've got something that's way more pathogenic, okay, delta, and way more contagious, which is Omicron. And this can happen, okay. Emil Bergqvist and Nella Brusseliers and I had an article in Politico back in January last year where we argued this is a worry, and everybody ignored it. Okay, but now they're starting to talk about it. Okay, and we are starting to see this. And remember now, it's not really that unlikely for a patient who's immune compromised to get multiple variants, because they can catch one and then have it for 6 months, and especially with persistence, even non-immune compromised patients might have it for a long time. These long COVID patients, they catch it again, they catch the new one, then you get it's a numbers game. The more times these things run into each other, the more chance there is that they can converge. That's a little bit oversimplification, but it's the way I think of it.
Is that a little bit like humans meeting Neanderthals and convert? Is that also an example of convergent evolution in a way?
Yeah, it wouldn't work. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the genetics of the Neanderthal to know whether we could mate. Okay, but this is
yeah. I think we have actually, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
So Andrew, what do you feel right now is the most interesting and relevant area of COVID studies and research?
Wow, that's a pack.
It could be your own, anything.
I think. I think what we really need are better. There's two sides. There's treatment, and there's understanding. Okay. We need to shut down transmission somehow, okay? And so, and since it's so bloody hard to get the human race to come together to work to stop transmission with simple things like masks, Just the masks are going to be, I have said many times, and I've been vilified for it, but I don't care. Masks, this argument against masks is going to go down in history as one of the dumbest periods or dumbest things that humans ever did. Okay, they work. I told you in the pre-thing, my daughter went to school in the midst of everybody getting COVID. Only one with a mask on, only one that didn't get it. And literally in her class, I think she was the only one, or maybe one other kid didn't get it. This has been my tool. Okay, my family's tool has been masks, and so I think I also have HEPA filters in my house, but that's probably not as big a deal. That's for when visitors manage to get in past my barriers. No, I'm kidding. But I think that's an important thing. But I think understanding what's happening to the brain and so forth is important. And as a scientist, I think we need to know what's happening to the brain, the heart, okay, the liver, and the blood vessels and the immune system. Okay, and we need to know it now. And the reason is because the biggest thing we need is better vaccines. We need a sterilizing vaccine. If there's any way to come up with a sterilizing vaccine, boy, that will shut this down over some time. Keep in mind that when we got rid of smallpox, people always say, "Oh, we vaccinated our way out of smallpox." That's absolutely wrong. Okay, we used NPIs. Okay, and we shut down areas and then vaccinated when a case came up, and then ring vaccinated around them.
Stop.
Okay?
And NPIs.
Oh, non-pharmaceutical interventions. Okay, and so I mean this has been around since the Silk Road passages, right? I mean they used to quarantine in the Silk Road. So these interventions, but it was a combination. They tried, if you go back and look at history, they tried to vaccinate out of smallpox, and it didn't work. We couldn't do it and keep it uniform enough across the world. And so they had to do it. We had people who went out and really worked hard to do the tracing and then managed to find who else were the contacts and vaccinate all those and do it and then shut things down around that. And so this was, in those days, that was the way it worked. But we'll have to do something like that. But if we get what we need a sterilizing vaccine first. In the absence of a sterilizing vaccine, and even with it, because we'll still have some cases for quite a long time, we need better treatments. Okay, and it's going to be targeted. There's going to be cocktails of drugs that we'll need. We need drugs that are going to affect the platelets. We need drugs that and stop them from releasing the serotonin. We need drugs that are going to help proliferation, or maybe slow down proliferation of T cells. We're going to need drugs that help stop the inflammation, to stop things from crossing barriers, like into the brain, across the placenta, etc. These kind of things. We're going to need all these things. Okay, it's going to be. Remember how they started out with AIDS? Okay, with the treatments, it was a cocktail, right? I mean, and it's because it affects so many parts of the body. This is a systemic disease. It's vascular in nature, but it's a systemic disease. And so I think the really exciting place to be right now is in vaccines and treatments. But of course, this is kind of like applied versus basic research. And as a basic researcher, I'm always asked, well, what good is basic research? You don't actually solve something. And I always point out that without my basic research, the applied people don't have anything to build on, okay? And so you need both. We need to figure out what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the heart and the blood vessels and so forth. But we need people that are going to take that as fast as possible and turn it into treatments.
And just to make sure what a sterilizing vaccine is for our mainly Swedish audience, it's one that stops
transmission.
Transmission, exactly.
Yes. This is the problem with the vaccine today, is it doesn't stop transmission. There's some argument that the Novavax is better at stopping transmission, but it's kind of early data. There's some people out there that really swear by Novavax, and I'm twice Novavax vaccinated. Okay, and I looked at the data, and I think I concur. I'm not sure, but I think so. So I think it's, if you have to go in for another shot of vaccine, you might think about it. But keep in mind, the Novavax only really works well if you take 2 shots. Okay, so you need 1 shot and then 4 weeks later another shot. It's not really meant to be used as a booster. Okay, and And the vaccine clinics don't know this. Okay.
Andy, we have another question again. It's a lengthy one. I'll try to shorten it down a little bit. But our Swedish so-called experts say that reinfections strengthen your immune system. And sort of like a cold, you develop an immunity. What do you have to say about this? Because it's probably what a lot of people in Sweden actually think today.
God, I don't know why this is raging. The immune system is not like a muscle, okay? This is what they think, okay? This is not, that you have the innate immune system and you have the acquired immune system. This is true. So this is why people think, oh, you need to build immunity to something. But the word build is a misnomer. You gain immunity to that thing. You're not really building immunity, okay? This is not like you're strengthening the immune system when you get this. And for sure with COVID, the data, my Twitter thread has 26 or 27 references, but and some of them are really strong references. COVID damages the immune system, okay, causes dysregulation. There's about 20 more papers. I'm working on a new document, okay, on this for the World Health Network. And it's the idea that it strengthens immunity is rubbish, okay? You do get some immunity, and you do, this idea of hybrid immunity is also a term that I hate, okay? You do get some immunity from having COVID, but you also get all the bad things with the COVID, and it doesn't last either, okay? And it damages your immune system, so it probably opens the door for these more severe RSV and flu and everything else. I mean, now, is it everybody? No, probably not, hopefully not. But it's definitely a large proportion of people, okay? And so they're really selling us something that they want us to believe because they want this to go away. This is not truth, okay? This is not truth. And I think that this is coming back almost to the same concept as immunity debt, and it's this hybrid immunity or immunity through infection. It's the old thing about chicken pox parties. Well, chicken pox was fairly benign, and most people got immunity for life. But you didn't see people having measles parties, okay? Because measles is not so benign, all right? And it's not clear what really has happened. I mean, for a long time we thought mononucleosis was fairly benign. It's a nasty disease, knocks you out for 6 weeks. But now, last year a paper in Nature came out, and really nice study, longitudinal study, and it shows that that all ALS, I think it's ALS patients, can be linked back to having had the virus. I won't give the acronym because I'm bad with acronyms, that causes mononucleosis. I mean, it's really scary. I mean, what we're doing with the idea that we should go in and, hey, let's go get COVID so that we can knock it down. Keep in mind, the immunity wanes, so you're going to have to, it's not getting a vaccination now. Now you're getting the disease. Are you going to go get the disease every 6 months on purpose? This is really nonsensical.
Let me just say for the Swedish listeners that mononucleosis is körtelfeber.
Okay. Yeah.
And we have another question here in the chat, probably our last one, perhaps.
Okay.
When do you think we will see a tipping point of the situation?
That was the title of our paper in January last year, earlier this year. Tipping points are funny. Tipping points, you don't usually have one, you have multiples. So you have to define what it is you're going past. We've already gone past one or more tipping points. Okay, there's no going back. We could have eradicated this disease, and maybe not eradicated, we could have eliminated. The difference, eradicated means completely erase it. Eliminated means get it down to a very low manageable level. We could have done that in 2020 if we had tried. The WHO actually came out and wrote a very strong statement on this last year, so maybe a year afterwards, and said that we could have done this. A number of people some people argue with it, like the Great Barrington supporters, but most people, even a lot of minimizers, as they're called, I don't know if I like that term either anymore, but a lot of people who are, or who we don't particularly like, they're more COVID supporters in a way. They agree that we could have eliminated it early on. So we passed that tipping point probably in the wave in the fall of 2020. Okay, if not the winter wave afterwards. The tipping point in terms of damage is going to come, I think, sometime this year. I think we're going to reach a tipping point where we see so much damage, that we see so many people going in and for secondary things, and we start really realizing what's happening, that you're going to get both a medical, or not both, a combination of a medical, a scientific, and a political tipping point, because you're going to see people get pretty upset about what's happening to their friends, their neighbors, their children. And I mean, I think this is part of what the political forces now are trying to fight against and hide. They don't want us to know that it's because of what they've done with COVID that we're getting the things we're seeing now. I think we'll see a tipping point sometime in 2023. Some people I know think it's going to be earlier. I think it'll be more later. I think we need to go through another rough winter, and then we'll see it. But I'm hoping I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong on this. I don't know how many times during the pandemic I've said this. I hope I'm wrong, but I nobody wants this. I would love for this to go away. I don't want to ever go back to 2019, because I didn't think that we were doing so good then anyway. Okay, in terms of some things like climate change and so forth. But I definitely would like to go back to some things, okay? and we need that, okay? But I think at this point in time, we adjust. I mean, through life, if you look through history, there's been many times where different things came up, different situations, whether it was disease or whether it was a new social structure or whatever it is, and we adjust, right? Humans are adaptable. And so we need to adapt to this. I don't mean that we should go hide in our closets and in terror, okay? But I think we just need to analyze what we're doing, look at how we keep ourselves safe, and go do it, and minimize our risks. Not maybe we can't eliminate them, but we can minimize them. I think one thing to keep in mind is that masks work, but masks don't work if you take them off at inopportune times. Okay, so if you go out to eat with somebody and you're in a restaurant that doesn't have good ventilation, and then you take off your mask to have dinner, and then it turns out they had COVID, well, you're going to probably have it too, unless they're really low viral load. And so there's things that you have to think about with all this. I don't know. It will change. I mean, our whole younger youth culture revolves around bars and cheap restaurants. And so that's a problem. I mean, somehow somebody's going to have to come up with an alternative to that helps the youth socialize and yet doesn't lead to that. It might actually, who knows? I don't know. I'm not a big fan of bars. Okay, I was when I was younger, to be fair. Okay, but I'm not a big fan. So I think we might come up with solutions that are good in this world.
And I'm actually going to botch the very beautiful transition into the masks that we could have used and ask you just one more thing before we end the show. A couple of weeks ago, Swedish radio, the scientific broadcasts, argued, there was a Swedish scientist on there, Håkan, I believe. He was excited about some Swedish research that shows that the brain damage actually goes away, that it's not permanent, that after 6 months the markers for damage are gone, even if there are still symptoms for long COVID, post-COVID. Could you just comment on that? I think people are wondering.
I hope it wasn't one of the authors of the study, if it was, because it's that people have misinterpreted that study, and hopefully their own authors don't. That study was for biomarkers of ongoing disease. Okay, and it was published about a year and a half ago, and it was published a while ago. This is an older study, okay, and it was done here at Gothenburg. And the biomarkers for disease go away at about 6 months. It's in my brain thread. If you look at my original brain thread, it's one of the papers in there. But it doesn't mean the damage is gone. It means that you don't have ongoing damage. So it's actually frightening instead. It means that for 6 months, the damage was continuing, okay? And then the damage stopped going on. But this is a marker for ongoing damage. So it's kind of like saying that I've gotten this pair of glasses here, my 3-year-old's glasses, and I'm going to snap off one of the things here, okay? And say, oh, okay, but after 6 months, nothing else snaps off, okay? All right, well, that's still missing, okay? That's still missing. This is the problem. And so we don't know whether it's repairing. The brain is very resilient, especially in younger people. The brain is resilient in adapting, not necessarily replacing. And there are some cells that are replaced. The old story from decades ago that brain cells never replicate is not correct. But they don't replicate the same as most cells in the body, okay? And so you can have permanent damage. And so the statement that they're making is incorrect. I mean, they did the same thing about a year and a half ago. I'd have to go back and look at the dates. They came out and made a big press release. Oh, look, damage is gone after 6 months. And it was like, no, the ongoing, the thing that's causing the damage stops after 6 months in this group, in this cohort. It doesn't mean that the damage is gone. I'm really frustrated with them. So.
Thank you.
Just bad interpretation of science.
As we begin to wrap up, and Maria is thinking if she has any further question that she missed, and maybe Andrew, you think about whether there's anything, a last thing you want to leave us with. Let me just point out that there's a comment in the chat and a question. So the comment is about Cuba. It apparently has a different kind of vaccine, it says here in the comment. And it is one of the countries with the lowest rate of infections in the world. And there's a link here about a visit with a scientific delegation that could be interesting to look at. So if you have any comments about that, you're welcome. But there's also a question about how many Novavax does one need? And when should one take a third, if? Very practical question.
Again, I'm not a doctor, okay? But what I have seen, okay, what I have been told, so this is secondhand, is that Novavax, and I know if you look at the literature from Novavax, it's supposed to be first dose, then 4 weeks, 3 to 5 weeks later, second dose. And then I've been told by some people who are knowledgeable, so I think they might be right, that 8 months later you should take a third dose. Okay. And then after that, I don't think anybody knows, anybody's guess. But it does seem like its immunity, at least for serious diseases, lasts a bit longer than the mRNA vaccines. And so it's, anybody's guess. I did it. I also have a friend who recently went to Cuba and got vaccinated. So I don't know. He's betting on it, hoping it's going to work. I don't know. The information out of different countries is hard to tell. Maybe they've got it.
Any last thing you want to leave us with, Andrew, before we round off?
Yeah, just don't get it. Try to avoid it. Okay. And if you do get it, it's not the end of the world. Just then work to not get it again. Yeah.
Very good. We have a tradition of ending these broadcasts by presenting our own masks and putting them on. So I suggest I'm going to put on my little Cambridge Pro FFP2. Maria, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you. You must be
You're
muted.
muted.
Sorry. I said mine's from Mask Lab, Hong Kong. Thanks very much for tonight, and talk to you all later.
Thank you so much,
FFP3.
Andrew. Thanks, Maria.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.